Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of our Accelerated ID series. My name is Shawntay Skjoldager and I will be your host. So let's get started. Why does it matter if slides are well designed? A slide can either support a learning experience to help drive home a key message, to help make it more concrete, make it help people visualize what that is in the mind, or it can become a distraction. It could cause cognitive overload. Have you ever looked at a slide and you're like, whoa, that's a lot, right? So those are the types of slides that we want to avoid making as instructional designers. So as we go through this Accelerated ID episode today about designing slides at SLAY, we're going to talk about some best practices or good practices, and then we're going to talk about some of those practices that you want to avoid. We're going to talk about good slide design first. So whenever we're talking about good slide design, we want to make sure that the content that you do put on the slide is clear and concise, right? So we don't want anything ambiguous. We don't want to have like paragraphs or blocks of text. We need it to be clear and concise so someone can scan it and understand what the meaning is. We also need to have legible fonts. So sometimes it can be fun to play with different fonts and bring those in, but if you're using a font that is difficult to read, then it can cause a distraction. Also, we want to make sure that we are bringing in consistent design elements. So what I mean by that is, like, maybe you have a color palette that you are using for your slides. You want to make sure you're using that color palette throughout. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to use the exact same colors on every single slide. So if you have 4 colors, it doesn't mean that all 4 colors have to be on the slide. It just means that you're using those same 4 colors throughout the presentation and you're making connections between those colors. So let's say that you're using, I'll use my colors for example. I use white, I use gray, I use teal, I have maroon, and then I kind of have like this little bright pinky maroony red color. I should really come up with a name with that. So if I have those are my colors and then all of a sudden I'm using orange, well, that is kind of confusing and it can cause a distraction. Now, that doesn't mean that I would never have a use case for using a color that's not a part of my palette. I might use it to like really draw attention to something, but you don't want to just have random colors that you're using throughout. You don't want a rainbow slide deck unless rainbows are a part of your theme, right? Where you want to have all that color. It's also good to tell a story with your slides. And whenever we're talking about a story here, we're really talking about a visual story. So we can use imagery and videos and processes and charts and graphs and things like that to help us tell a visual story. And we're going to talk about that more in just a second. We also want to use contrasting colors. Now, if you are a student in my program, you have probably heard me say that we need to have good contrast. This is one of the things that I provide feedback on a lot whenever I am reviewing any kind of something that has a design to it. So contrasting colors, you want to have a really good, strong contrast between your background color and your font color. And if you go out to some of the accessibility checkers out there, you'll see that there is a recommended ratio of 4:5:1. Now, don't ask me what all those numbers mean because I really don't know. I just know that I need to hit those, okay? So we want to make sure that the font color is that it stands out from that background. That makes it easier for people to read, right? So if they have any kind of visual impairment at all, that strong background font contrast can really be helpful. And then we also want to make sure that we are using images and graphics, but not just any image. It's got to be a relevant image. And we're going to look at an example of that in just a second. Sometimes we put images on slides that are they're kind of related. They're indirectly related, but there's not a strong correlation to the content on the slides. And that is one thing that we can do as instructional designers to really improve our slide design is making sure that everything that goes on the screen supports what it is that we are saying, right? Without there being too much or any kind of distraction. So now we're going to break down some of these things. We're going to look at some examples. So this is an example, and we're not going to look at all of them. We're just going to look at some of them. This is actually an example from brightcarbon.com. Bright Carbon is one of my favorite, absolute favorite PowerPoint. I don't even know what you call them. They're not a PowerPoint provider, but they offer PowerPoint training, and they do some really incredible and amazing things with PowerPoint slides, from making Christmas cards that they send out. If you're not on their email list, then I suggest that you go out to brightcarbon.com and join their email list, because they'll send you a monthly newsletter that will tell you about free trainings that they have coming up. So let's look at this example. This is and why this is an example of visual storytelling. So on the screen, you can see that it says only 20% of businesses are connected to high-speed fiber broadband, right? Now, look at that picture. There is only a sliver of that picture that's in color. Everything else is kind of grayed out. So that's representing the 20%. So that's an example of visual storytelling, right? So you've got this like side of a building picture with all these offices in there, but only a sliver is in color, which represents that 20%. So that really drives home for me like how little 20% is whenever you are using it to compare against the rest of that image that's there. So I really like this. This is an example. All right, so now let's look at white space and contrast. So here you can see that there is a lot of white space on the screen. Whoever created this slide, and this came from a slidestream.net example, the person that created this, you can see that they used a lot of white space. And then look at the title. It says Breaking Stereotypes, Unconscious Bias. Now look at the little call out bubble for the woman. And you see it's like all what we would stereotype as girly stuff, right? Makeup and different things. Then you look at the man and you see all the stereotypy things for the man, like tools, right? So to me, that's a really great visual example of the stereotypes that we put out there, right? And great use of, they didn't use a lot of text on this slide. I didn't need text to understand the stereotypes that they were referring to here. And then we have contrast. So we have contrast between the white and the orange and the blue and the white and the title, or even in their clothing against that white background. This is an example of color in graphics. So we can also use color in graphics to help depict information, to make it stand out on the screen. So you can tell a couple of things here. So we can see just by the numbers that the percentages are increasing, right? Because they get bigger, 4, 6, 8. So that's visual. But then look what else they did. They didn't just change the numbers. They also made the boxes grow with the example. So you could see that 4% has one size box, then 6% has a little bit bigger box, and then premium has an even larger box. And then you can see that they use different colors to help those really stand out from one another. So this is another example of how you can tell a story with your visuals or help things stand out, right? Okay. So now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about things that maybe we want to avoid whenever we are creating slides. Now, as we go through this, know that not every presentation, including mine, will hit on every one of these buckets every single time. As instructional designers who are creating slides, we just try to do our best. We know what the best practices are. We try to implement as many as we can. But sometimes, depending on what we're working against, some of these things can get in our way. Sometimes we work with stakeholders within the organization who want a lot of text on screen. Sometimes we work with clients who want something that goes against these best practices or the things to avoid. So as instructional designers, we're going to talk about what we don't want to do, but know that sometimes these things happen anyway, despite our best efforts. So the first thing up is you don't want to overload the slides, right? So you don't want to have so much on the slide that somebody's like trying to look around the screen to go, okay, what am I looking at? Where should my eye be? So that's one thing that we don't want to do. We also don't want to have too much content on the screen. So these two things kind of overlap, right? Overloading the slides could be too much content, too many graphics, too many different colors, too many different sizes, right? It could be a whole bunch of things. Content, we're specifically talking about the text. And then I went too far. I'm really trying to get adjusted to the new computer. You also want to avoid having an inconsistent design. So this goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, where you want to have like a theme or a design that you are working within. So maybe it's colors, maybe it's a certain logo, maybe it's certain placement of different elements. You just want it to feel like it is cohesive. Then you also want to avoid having that poor contrast between text and background. Again, super important for visual accessibility. You also want to avoid overusing animation and graphics. Sometimes when people are new to PowerPoint or Canva or Google Slides, it could be really fun to experiment with all the different animation features that are available in these tools. But if you're using, like swirlies and zips and like bouncing animations, those things can just become a distraction because the learner is like really focused on what it is that you try to say or what you are saying. And then if you're using like a ball bounce on the screen, they're like watching, what you're doing. You use animations and graphical highlighting and things on screen to draw the eye where you want it. So you've just got to be judicious with the type of animation and how much animation you are using in your presentation. Then 6, this other piece that we want to try and avoid, or that could be considered poor slide design, is using data or text where it could be visual. So for example, the boxes, the 4, 6, and the 8, right? That could have been presented as a table. On 4% you get this, 6% you get this, 8% you get this. Or we could change it and make it more visual. Wherever you can bring in visual components instead of having text, maybe you're trying to show that something is increasing, maybe sales are increasing. Is there a graphical way to do that instead of putting on the screen? Sales increased by 20% in 2018 over 2017, right? Is there a way that we could visualize this information so that when somebody first lays eyes on the screen, they know exactly what it is that you were talking about without having to stop and read what's there on the screen. So again, we're doing the highlights or other things that you would want to avoid, but these are the biggies that we often see. Too much text, inconsistent design, trying to cram too much information on the slide, using animations, like getting a little bit wonky or crazy with animations, not having enough contrast between the font and the background color. That one happens a lot. And then not using enough visuals to replace text, just to break things up.